On today's World Insight, tensions on the high seas, what a U.S. Navy dual carrier drill in the South China Sea means for relations and stability. And recent spikes in U.S. coronavirus infections, as many as 50,000 a day, worry public health experts. A word with the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine.
We have an interest in making sure that infectious diseases which don't respect borders are controlled everywhere.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Let's begin the program with worsening tensions between China and the United States. Two U.S. aircraft carriers, the USS Ronald Reagan and USS Nimitz, are in the waters of the South China Sea. It's the first time Washington sent two carriers for drills in the area since 2014. This when the Chinese Navy had just begun military drills in the area days before. China's foreign ministry said the U.S. had deliberately sent the ships to the South China Sea to flex its muscles and accused Washington of trying to drive a wedge between China and countries in the region. So, what does the presence of the two carriers from the U.S. mean for regional stability? How big is the potential damage to already frosty China-U.S. relations? Let's loop in our guest on this. On the South China Sea issue, we are joined via Zoom in Shanghai, Shending Li, professor from the Institute of International Studies, Fudan University in D.C., Michael O'Halloran, who is a senior fellow with the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence and director of the Research for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. How shall we assess the danger that is going on right now in South China Sea in terms of the face-off, quote-unquote, as some say, between China and the United States? Mr. O'Halloran.
I think it's always concerning when you have the world's two greatest superpowers in close proximity with their military forces, and they each have somewhat competing views about the future proper role of the South China Sea and of who should be there with which assets. On the other hand, I don't really expect any kind of conflict because I think that both sides realize in the end they can't lightly take aim at each other's military forces. And the United States in this particular situation mostly wants to reaffirm international rite of passage. So I don't think that China is really going to try to prevent the carriers from operating in the South China Sea. I don't think the United States is going to try to prevent China from building up or sustaining military assets on the various islands in the South China Sea. Each side sort of has to accept some things the other side is doing that it might not prefer.
Okay.
But I think in the end, that's what will happen.
Professor Shen, I really want to have your opinions as well about that.
Well, I think the two countries share lots of common interests. They want to maintain the region peaceful and stable, and they don't want to use force to resolve any conflict. But both Navy are staging their drill in this place and presenting their will and muscle, making people a bit concerned if they want to use military to reinforce their claim for China's claim that it has legitimate sovereign and historical rights, and the U.S. claim to keep the region free of threat by exercising its right of freedom of navigation. That's a bit upsetting.
China seems to have the impression, Professor Shen, that by claiming or putting a tag of China being quote-unquote assertive, the U.S. could explore the space of putting a tag to China like that and therefore increase its presence in the South China Sea. The two aircraft carrier is a great reflection, quote-unquote, of that. Is that true, Professor Shen?
Well, as Michael has said, the U.S. presence in the region is a response to China's growing military presence in accordance to China's claim in the area encircled by non-dash line. But in China's view, China may have a different opinion. The U.S. Navy sailed into the territorial water of Plazo, Jisha-Pingdao. And so the UNCLOS would allow the U.S. to do this under the name of innocent passage. But the frequent sailing in such a close area to China territory, this island, which is not disputed between China and the U.S., but sending military to such a close area, in China's view, is not a response to China's military presence. But in China's view, is a show that the U.S. has an interest and should maintain not only peace and stability, but also its dominion in the region. That U.S. may not agree, but China may have perceived this way. This kind of Chinese perception, and the U.S. may refuse to be perceived this way, exactly generate the kind of contradiction and may lead the two military to some unpleasant event, even though we don't want them to conflict.
Okay, Mr. O'Hanlon, how confident is the U.S. side that it will not play with the fire in a way, quote unquote, and there will not be any conflict or any accident? How certain is the United States could be about that?
Well, I think there are two answers to that question, which are somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, we've all seen this news that two aircraft carriers are headed for the South China Sea, and most people are not talking about it very much. You know, we seem pretty calm because we're used to this sort of issue. Now, we don't always send two aircraft carriers, but we have frequently asserted the right of innocent passage, as Professor Deng-Xing Li just said. So in that sense, it feels sort of normal. And in the United States this week, people are talking more about the explosion of our COVID cases and the presidential election than they are about sending two aircraft carriers to the South China Sea.
Because your media have been reporting very little about that, because you have a bigger crisis that you have to fight, another fire. But it doesn't mean this fire is becoming smaller. It does not justify that, I'm afraid.
No, I agree. That's what I'm trying to get at. So on the one hand, you asked me how we're interpreting this. On the one hand, people seem pretty calm.
I'm asking you, how could the United States be able to guarantee there will not be any playing of fire?
Well, I think that's a different question. And what I was about to say is that most of us who follow U.S.-China strategic relations are nervous. I think we're nervous on both sides of the Pacific. My guess is that Professor Deng-Xing Li is a little nervous. I'm a little nervous. When we see the world's two most powerful countries trying to figure out a new way to coexist in the Western Pacific, as China's power has given it many more capabilities than it ever had before in this region, we are all a little bit nervous. So even though this is not the top headline in the newspaper, I think we have to worry, as you say, that we cannot guarantee that this will be safe. And so I would prefer that the two sides try to figure out some kind of a compromise. I think China needs to accept the United States is going to keep moving its Navy in the South China Sea, but the United States needs to accept that China will pursue some of its ambitions in that region in economic and territorial terms in regard to islands, in regard to economic development. Neither side is going to like that compromise perfectly, but that would be safer than having our military forces operate in this sort of a tense way in close proximity to each other.
Professor Shen, it was from the year 2009 that the U.S. has been consistently increasing its presence militarily in the South China Sea, according to some of the media, international media reports. For example, the number of ships in the region, the number of sorties increasing to a much bigger number than it used to be. And now we have seen, since the COVID-19 outbreak, the U.S. side did not decrease, but rather doing the other way around. Well, China is also trying to fight an outbreak like that. So how shall we understand the ever-increasing presence of U.S. military in the South China Sea? Will China do the same? How will China guarantee about not having any accident?
As our conversation between Michael and myself have been developed in such a way, the U.S. presence in this region in South China Sea is, in Michael's view, is a response to China's growing military activity in the region. Therefore, U.S. want to do something to make sure the region is still peaceful and stable. But despite the U.S. best intention, China has perceived this not exactly as the U.S. has presented. Primarily, when the U.S. naval ship sailed into the territorial water of Spratly, these are within 12 nautical miles. Theoretically, the UNCLOS would allow the U.S. to do this because the U.S. can claim its right of innocent passage. But China has its own national law. That may make China to think its national law may supersede with the international law. National law of the maritime territorial water law states, without China's prior permit, other countries' ship shall not sail into. U.S. use international law. China has not enforced its national law by kicking out the U.S. Ship. But China is nervous. As Michael has stated, both countries should reduce their apprehension with each other or against each other by making some dialogue and making some concession with each side. China should present itself in a way in the region not to disrupt the international sea lane of communication, so freedom of navigation of whatever civilian or military is guaranteed. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, the U.S. should accord more consciousness. This is China's territorial water. U.S. can do this kind of sailing probably outside, a bit distant from China's island.
What we are talking about today is not what we talked about in 2009. There's a huge difference in terms of the strategic relations between China and the United States. And this is an election year. This is also a year that has been haunted by this global pandemic, which make every economy, every government, every country suffers and feel nervous about. So what does that mean, this South China Sea issue, reflected by increasing military presence from both sides? Are they trying to play with fire at this critical point? Are they trying to answer their domestic nationalism in some corners of the societies? Do we have people that really have cool mind?
Generally, Chinese government and the media and the public may perceive the U.S. increasing presence in the region so close to China's territory as at least unfriendly or maybe hostile. Coupled with the recent U.S. Air Force, it's a transporter flying over the space of Taiwan. In China's view, Taiwan is a part of China, and Taiwan space is China's territorial space. When China and the U.S. made the official relationship in 1979, U.S. agreed to withdraw its military from Taiwan. Now the U.S. military, the Air Force, is flying over Taiwan. And the U.S. Marine has released its video having court drill training program wearing U.S. uniform. And they are operating in Taiwan with Taiwan's military force. All this violated China-U.S. agreement. All U.S. troops should withdraw from Taiwan. That forms the foundation for China-U.S. official relationship, the so-called normalization. China would perceive all this as a kind of provocation. This is my observation.
Mr. O'Hanlon.
I don't know any Americans who want to have a showdown with China in naval terms in the South China Sea. No one wants that. There's no domestic pressure for that. So to the extent that's happening, to some extent with these aircraft carriers, I think it's more a reflection of the national military strategy and the national defense strategy of Secretary Mattis. And he said that we should be strategically predictable, but operationally unpredictable. Mattis, when he was Secretary of Defense in 2017 and 2018, he proposed this somewhat more flexible and creative and unpredictable way of operating U.S. military forces. And I think that's the logic that you're seeing right now, because Secretary of Defense Esper has said that his job is really to implement the strategy that Jim Mattis created.
However, unpredictability does not mean ruining the earlier agreement. Unpredictability does not also mean that there will not be any logic that should be followed in terms of respecting each other's bottom lines. So, Mr. O'Hanlon, while trying to understand the ego of every U.S. general and every administration official currently in Washington, people are having a hard time trying to understand why the U.S. will not go with the earlier agreement with China about Taiwan, as Professor Shen earlier mentioned, and some of the other things regarding security. This is not just about trade. This is about security.
Well, I agree that the Taiwan issue is especially delicate. And on this issue, I think China has been consistent for many decades. We all know China's view, and we know that China views Taiwan as an integral part of its own sovereign territory, and that it hopes someday for reunification, and that it may not be patient forever. All those things we understand, and those things have been consistent from China for many, many decades. So I think that I personally am in favor of handling the Taiwan issue with the utmost of care and trying not to disrupt past patterns.
The increasing presence of military in the South China Sea are making these economies also more nervous about a reluctant choice they had to make in the near future, and they don't want to do that. So, Mr. O'Hanlon, while thinking about the security, does the U.S. also thinking about its commitment to create peace in the region, even for its allies?
Yes, the great challenge of our time, in my opinion, is to figure out how China will play a much greater role than before, given its new power, economic power, strategic and diplomatic power, military power, in a way that's still in the mutual interest of everyone in the region. And so in this regard, the United States and China are sort of natural balancers against each other. It's not like the Cold War. I don't think it's containment. I don't think it has to be hostile. But in some sense, we are trying to figure out how China can be more powerful and influential, but in a way that also respects the traditional rights of other countries. And the United States has to find a way to, again, balance China's presence, but try to also acknowledge that China is going to rise and be more powerful than it has been before. And that's going to sometimes require uncomfortable choices for us. The key is to protect the most important things: territorial sovereignty, sea lanes, economic choices, diplomatic choices for all countries in the region.
Mr. O'Hanlon, of course, you are the very sensible voice coming from Washington. We respect that. Professor Shen, your thoughts?
I think China and U.S. can work together to reduce such a challenge for them to choose. U.S. purpose is to make the region predictably peaceful and stable. So U.S. may have some worry. China is wise. China reclaim the land, and China may militarize the island. So U.S. want to make sure China will not do more. And China want to talk to each of them individually through many parallel bilateral talk to be coupled with multilateral talk. China is willing to talk. So probably U.S. can encourage us, China, Vietnam bilateral, China, ASEAN multilateral, to talk this important security and economic issue. Therefore, each side can make some compromise and would gain some access through collaboration. While our two sides still need to talk to reduce any unintended negative consequence due to such a kind of operational unpredictability. So I would urge our two military should meet and talk.
Shending Li, Michael O'Halloran, thank you so much, gentlemen. It's wonderful to hear logical and also intellectual discussion and debate between the two of you. I want to thank you for that. And you're watching World Insight, still to come on our program. Recent spikes in U.S. coronavirus infections, as many as 50,000 a day, worry public health experts. A word with the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine right after this break. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. COVID-19 spreads virtually unchecked across the United States. Johns Hopkins tally showed almost 100,000 new cases over the weekend in the U.S., and the total confirmed cases surged over 3 million. Florida has reported the daily highs of 10,000 new cases. Arizona has seen record hospitalization. Countless Americans joined the festivities across the country. Health experts fear in 5 to 7 days there will be a new spike in cases. Donald Trump and Joe Biden have both made the pandemic a top campaign issue, and Trump's campaign team says it will hold another rally this week. That's despite criticism from health experts of previous election events, as some Trump staffers later tested positive for the virus. Well, many states are gradually reopening their economy. It was a daunting challenge for some that opened too quickly. What's the public health prognosis in the U.S. now? Earlier, I talked to, in an exclusive interview with Dr. Eric Rubin, the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. He told me a lack of leadership left the states to fend for themselves. And I'm joined by Dr. Eric Rubin, editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. Dr. Rubin, what a pleasure to see you.
Nice to be in touch again.
I know Boston is doing much better than last time we were talking. So tell me more about where you are and how situations are.
The number of cases and the number of resultant deaths has declined substantially in Boston, and in fact around all of the northeastern states in the United States. And that's allowed a gradual reopening of the economy here.
I see a divide almost in terms of results of the last few months among different states and cities. So how should we understand the various degrees of achievements? And some states, though, are not doing well at all.
That's right. In the United States, public health is largely driven at the state level,
yes, not
so much at the federal level. And particularly now, where the federal government has not taken a very strong leadership role, I'd say, it's left it up to the states to decide what to do, and states have set their own policies. On top of that, there are different degrees of buy-in, I think, from the populace in different places. In the Northeast, where we've had a very severe outbreak, people understand that the disease is a problem, and they have largely kept with guidelines. But that's been a little less true in other parts of the country, which hadn't really seen much disease in the earlier phases.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, in a recent interview with National Public Radio, admitted that it was a mistake earlier by the public health officials not to support the public wearing masks, and even suggest the other way around. Even though now, in retrospect, the public health officials said they made those statements only because the masks, particularly masks that professionals could wear, were limited at the time. This is a very interesting story, but certainly a story that could cost lives.
The failure was to communicate the clear message, not the simple message, but the real message, which was we were not certain of how well cloth masks would work. And we thought that the highest priority was for healthcare workers to have masks. But somehow that got translated into the general public shouldn't wear masks at all, and only healthcare workers should wear them. Obviously, there's a contradictory message. Why, if they're important enough for healthcare workers to wear, shouldn't other people be wearing them? And I think that they were trying to strike a balance and probably missed on the messaging.
Time is precious. So how should we see the public debate? On the one hand, the thorough knowledge that people need to have and the rational choices they need to make, and also the public health officials articulating all the messages vis-a-vis the precious time that we are running against in order to save lives, particularly looking at the U.S. situation, about 50,000 new cases every day now.
I think there are two issues here. One is what we talked about, is how to properly message so that people can understand. People are smarter than we give them credit for, but they're trying to think through these issues, and I think that we have to provide them with accurate information, not just a bottom line, but how did we get there? What is the rationale for doing what we do?
Yes.
But clearly, we need political leadership as well to communicate that message, and we have, I think, had inconsistent messaging at the level of our political leaders.
From a public health perspective, do you think the federal level should play a bigger role now?
Look, whatever mistakes were made in the past, there are still plenty of room to fix them. And I think a lot of that responsibility does fall on the federal government, in part because the states need that leadership, and also because there's a lot of political gamesmanship around what's really a deadly disease, and it would make it far simpler for states to toe a line if a sensible one was being advanced at the federal level.
Whether the U.S. is having the danger of eventually going to herd immunity without a vaccine, which could mean huge loss of lives. If you look at the current growth rate and the current growing trend.
Well, it seems like it's going to take a lot to get to the level of
Yes,
herd immunity.
that's true.
I don't think we're close to that yet. And one of the striking things right now, and we'll see what happens, is that in many of the states where there's a large increase in case rate, it's happening in younger people, and they're the people who are much less likely to die of disease. What that means to me is that it seems likely that older people are practicing social distancing, are staying at home, and so I think that the message is varying for people who are more concerned about their own health and people who are not so concerned that they'll get sick. So I think it's possible that we could get a lot of disease with fewer deaths because of the demographics of the people who are not taking such strong precautions.
What if there were a second round, and what if there were even a third round? How do you see those possibilities and the danger those could mean for us?
In the U.S., we never went away. It never went away, and there doesn't, unless things change, there's no prospect of the disease going away. So, and it's going to continue at least at a low level, hopefully at a lower level than we're at right now. So I think I worry about the disease not going away in places, because if it doesn't go away in some places, it's going to come back in others. So calling it a second round or a third round isn't really helpful. We've got to get rid of it everywhere. And that's why what's happening in the U.S. matters to you in China, because eventually it'll get back to China if we can't control it here. And the same goes for any country where there are outbreaks right now. They spread. It's an infectious disease, and it doesn't know to stay in a country. So we're going to continue to have problems as long as we can't control it in places.
We have to deal with a new normal, a time we have to learn to coexist with the virus, and it may take quite a while. That was said to me by Dr. Eric Rubin from the New England Journal of Medicine. So is the vaccine, though, I asked him, the only light at the end of the dark tunnel? What is the latest on the making of the vaccines, and how will they be delivered? I asked Dr. Rubin about these questions. Take a listen. In your journal, New England Journal of Medicine, recently have been articles about asymptomatic the percentage of asymptomatic, and their relations to the so-called pre-symptomatic, meaning actually eventually become symptomatic only at the time of the tests, the symptoms were not very obvious. So how should we understand these increasing numbers of concepts and concepts that we do not know thoroughly? Are you satisfied, Dr. Rubin, about the speed of our increasing knowledge of this virus so far?
I think that we haven't gotten a good handle on the ratio of asymptomatic to symptomatic disease. And just now studies are being done. We haven't really published any of them yet, but I know that there's information coming out there about how many people are asymptomatic. It's a relatively simple thing to test for, but it costs some tests, and that's not, we are still limited in testing in the US. In other countries which have fewer limits, it's going to be easier to tell. But in order to tell that number, you have to have a sufficient amount of disease and a sufficient number of tests to do surveillance, to use them for surveillance rather than just for treating patients. I think we are making progress in figuring out what the therapies of disease should be. And in particular, clearly the death rate appears to be dropping. It's dropped considerably since the initial outbreak in China. It's varied considerably from country to country, but I think that our supportive care has gotten much better. Our specific therapies are a little behind that, but they're people working toward that. I'd also add that the pace of vaccine development is incredibly impressive. I don't know it means it will end up with a vaccine shortly, but there is a huge amount of effort.
Let's talk about the treatment a bit, especially combination of treatment. Remdesivir, for example, which is being considered as one of the medicines that could help with the process of particularly curing the severely diseased, have been collected and bought by the United States, mainly, and the price is really gigantic given the ordinary price of medicines of the same category. So, Dr. Rubin, how should we see the interests within border and the interest globally, particularly with something called infectious disease, which is a global one?
Remdesivir is a special case, and I think it should, of course, be broadly available across the globe. There are issues with remdesivir. Number one, it doesn't appear to be that good. So it's not a miracle cure for anything.
No.
It will be useful for people who are the most sick. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like a tool at this point that's going to help us control the outbreak. All it's going to do is, we hope, save some lives. And we haven't even proven that yet. But that it looks encouraging for saving some lives. But it won't be the public health tool that we need, or at least not at this point. And then it's just recently approved in the U.S., and there isn't very much of it. And so the questions of how it gets allocated are substantial, both in the U.S. and should it be made, as it should be, available internationally there, because there just aren't going to be that many doses available. So right now, it's not the solution. It's a tool and one of many. But no question, it and any other therapy that made a difference should be more broadly available and should be thought of as a world resource rather than something that a single company owns. We have invested, the U.S. government, has invested a large amount of money in developing this drug and paying for clinical trials. And we should be using the leverage we have because of that to make sure that it becomes available.
So you are suggesting, Dr. Rubin, that it is about national border as long as the specific country invests in certain things, and it should have the priority or the precedence in a way in having ownership of it, and therefore it's not global public good. Is that what you're trying to say?
Oh, no, not at all. I'm saying that the in part because of the investment that we've made in that drug and almost any other drug that's developed, they should be seen as a public resource, not a U.S.-only resource, but a public resource. And we should be thinking about how best to use them rather than how best to make money off of them.
China suggested through the country's president that it will become a global public good, quote unquote. That's exactly what he said. We haven't seen pledge of that from any other country of the world or any other organization of the world. So how should we see the quite challenging reality we're facing right now if there were any successful vaccines?
I agree with the sentiment. It's vitally important that any vaccine be made widely available. And not doing so is counter to the interests of any individual country. It's not as if countries exist in isolation now. If there's an outbreak in Cambodia, it affects China. If there's an outbreak in Mexico, it affects the U.S. We have an interest in making sure that that infectious diseases which don't respect borders are controlled everywhere. So I think it's in everyone's interest that vaccines be widely available, and it's also the right thing to do. It's the ethical thing to do.
But to prepare in advance, that's the point, isn't it? That's why CEPI, Gavi are existing. They are supposed to establish platforms, and so are the latest platforms by the Gates Foundation in cooperation with the WHO and things like that. So so-called accelerator in a way. This is about that.
I think that's right. And I should say that CEPI and Gavi have had the participation of most of the major pharmaceutical companies. So they do buy into the idea. This is a little more complicated because many of the players in this vaccine space are small biotechs. They're companies that don't have the experience of producing a global vaccine in the past. And it might depend on who produces it, but I think that there is an impulse among many of the vaccine developers to make it widely available, even if any particular government is not so supportive of that idea.
But we see that with the swine flu, for example, with all kinds of diseases. In fact, many of the diseases humans have, with my little knowledge about public health, is a lot of them originally are coming from the animal world to the human world. Well, you could also argue we are actually part of that world anyway. So if we exclude those opportunities, actually we could only live, some could argue, in vacuum. So that is about how we can coexist with the reality like that, but at the same time taking better care of ourselves. But how would that be done? That is probably the most gigantic question the public health community around the world need to face right now.
I think there are a couple of answers to that. One is that we should be careful about what sorts of interactions we have with animals, particularly wild animals, because a lot of the new severe outbreaks like this one come from animals that we don't ordinarily interact with, probably. And if we're going to interact with them, then we've got to be careful about keeping them caged, keeping them around people. We really want to think through where do the risks occur. With influenza, which is our longtime nemesis, we know that that's an animal virus. We know that it's going to come from animals. The best thing we can do for that is anticipate it. And anticipating it means surveying the animals, which is being done particularly in China, and looking for new viruses arising and being prepared should those cross into humans. And that's really important. I think we were not adequately prepared for another coronavirus crossing over. We should similarly be prepared for the next coronavirus outbreak.
We have seen our world being transformed, like it or not, into a very different style. Different style of living, different style of interacting, different style of working. How much do you think we have been transformed, and how much is there to come?
I'm a big believer in medical progress, Tian Wei. I think that we are going to have vaccines. I think we're going to have more, I'm hopeful, more effective therapies, but I'm very hopeful, very optimistic about vaccines, and that those will allow us to get back to the old normal, not some new way of living. I think we're going to get there. It is going to be some time, and I think we have to have some patience rather than expect miracles around the corner.
And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can certainly search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching.